Hello, BookTube. We're continuing on with our read-along of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. I'm doing this read-along with David Murphy. I'll leave a link to his channel down below. And we are reading this book chapter by chapter, as opposed to the whole thing in one lump at the end of the month or every week or whatever. And we are at chapter 13 today, which is titled, Does Religion Make People Behave Better? And which therefore touches on one of the bedrock defenses of any kind of organized religion, but let's stick to organized to Christianity and all of its branches, that religious apologists have made through time immemorial. That without this, where would you be? That without these moral precepts, without this guidance, how would you even be able to make sense of the world? I mentioned yesterday the internet con man Dennis Prager, who has a series of YouTube videos in something that he calls PragerU. It's not a university. You don't get a degree. He's not in charge of anything. But he is backed by a huge amount of money, billions of dollars of money, to make those videos and to buy mouthpieces that will be most convenient for them. Going to make a right-wing nutjob talking point video that the goal of which is to strip women of all kinds of rights. Be sure to get a woman to make that video. And you might think, well, what woman would possibly read the script and do it? Well, a woman who needs $170,000 might very well do it for that money. A woman who needs $30,000 might do it. If she needs $30,000 but she has a conscience, she might say, no, I won't offer her $100,000. She'll probably do it. $170,000, you'll find it easy to do that, to find a woman to advocate for removing the vote or reproductive rights or anything else when it comes to women. If you want to resurrect Jim Crow era racial segregationist points, make sure you have a black academic to come on and do that. Dennis Prager does that on a routine basis. And one of his most watched videos is one that he did himself, in which he talks about the 10 Commandments are all you need to improve and have a perfect society. And one of the things he says in that video is that religion is where we get our ultimate sense of morality. That all other morality is either conditional or is based on religion without acknowledging it. That, as he puts it in that video, unless God says that murder is not wrong, murder is not wrong. The flip side being that because God says it's wrong, the vast majority of people in the world who would otherwise want to commit murder won't, because the ultimate moral arbiter says they shouldn't. This is a question. Does morality make people better? Does Christianity, for instance, does organized religion make people behave better? That atheists have been encountering forever. And it's amazing. And when you think about it, when you strip it away of the rhetorical three-card Monty, it's kind of amazing. When a Christian says to you, well, the fact that God authored my moral code is the only thing that keeps me obeying it, what is that Christian saying? That without that, they would rape and murder people. And atheists for the last 100 years have had to say to those people, well, actually, I don't believe in God or any ultimate moral authority, and I have murdered in my life exactly as many people as I ever wanted to, which is none. So maybe it's more of a comment on you than it is on religion or morality. And that comes up in the course of this chapter. Hitchens relates a debate in which an atheist is confronted by a bishop who says, well, if you don't believe in God, then why don't you leave a life of unbridled immorality? And the atheist is affronted, calls it a monstrous insinuation. How could you make such an insinuation? Why would you think that I would be such a horribly morally bankrupt person that if I didn't have that leash on me, that's what I would do? It's a great question. It's really interesting. Unfortunately, you can see this coming a mile away. Hitchens doesn't do it justice in this chapter. This chapter is far meatier, far more intelligent, far more soberly composed than most of the rest of the book. This is where we see Hitchens at his finest, really, because he's insightful, he's multi-pronged, his arguments are nimble, his prose flows right along. It's a very thought-provoking chapter to read. It's only when you're finished with it and you think back on it that you start to get irritated with it. Because Hitchens is claiming here, of course, when he asks the question, does religion make people behave better? You know that his answer in a book called God is Not Great is going to be no. He's going to say no, that in fact, it makes people behave worse. And in this chapter, he finds people who have behaved monstrously with religion on their tongue and uses that to condemn religion. And that's as much dirty pool as the obverse would be. He writes, the argument that religious belief improves people, or that it helps to civilize society, is one that people tend to bring up when they have exhausted the rest of their case. Very well, they may seem to say. We cease to insist on the Exodus, or on the virgin birth, or even on the resurrection, or the night flight from Mecca to Jerusalem. But where would people be without faith? Would they not abandon themselves to every kind of license and selfishness? Is it not true, as Chesterton once famously said, that if people can't cease to believe in a God, they do not believe in nothing, but rather in anything? There's a lot of farrago there. There's a lot of nonsense in that paragraph, and unfortunately that paragraph and paragraphs like it are kind of the North Star by which this chapter navigates. And the strengths of Hitchens are on full display. This is bristling and brilliant. And his weaknesses are also on full display, because this is also deeply, deeply dishonest and misleading. And also it betrays Hitchens a sweet tooth of his, a weakness of his that I've mentioned in these videos before, of contrarian for contrarian's sake. It's not just that Hitchens in this book wants to smash sacred idols of religion. He wants to smash sacred idols of any kind, of any kind at all. So I don't even know where to start. There are so many examples in this chapter. So the British only started protesting and organizing against the transatlantic slave trade when it became unprofitable. Before that, no. It was only when it started to become unprofitable that people started to protest against it. Implying that no one protested for it on moral grounds before it started to become unprofitable, and that the people who protested against it when it started to become unprofitable had been disappointed in its profits, had some stake in it, in other words. One look at the abolitionist movement in Britain is enough to show you that that is not true. But Hitchens, of course, he doesn't linger. He stays, he blasts somebody, and then he moves on. So he will talk about the racial slaughter in Rwanda, for instance. A subject he knows really well. You can read him elsewhere on the subject of Rwanda and get a much clearer image of it that isn't deceptive. The version of it in this book is deceptive. The version of it, if you knew nothing about Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, other than what you encounter in God is Not Great, you would think that it was religiously motivated. When it wasn't. You would also think, another drive-by character assassination in here, you would think that the religious people, the religious advocates in Rwanda, who had very little power, there were corrupt members of the Catholic Church, but I'm talking about organizers against the genocide, of which there were many. They had very little power, but in this book you would think they didn't exist at all. That it was just one gigantic Catholic monolith mowing down innocent, ethnic minorities, and so on and so forth. The mention is made of William Lloyd Garrison, who was a great abolitionist in America. But what does Hitchens say about him? What does he say? That he only came into his own as an abolitionist once he stopped being a preacher and discovered the writings of Thomas Paine. I didn't mark that spot. I confess, you'd be marking things forever in this book if you were going to do that. Yeah, there we go. Mr. Garrison was a splendid man by any standards, but it is probably fortunate that all of his early religious advice was not followed. In Garrison's view, the United States and the Union were a covenant with death and ought to be destroyed. It was in effect he who called for the secession before the Confederates did. In later life, he discovered the works of Thomas Paine and became less of a preacher and a more effective abolitionist. No hint about where his abolitionist ire actually came from. It came from his religious faith. Also, Mahatma Gandhi, is raked over the coals here. His admittedly ham-fisted interventions in the politics of his nation are transformed here in the account that we have in this book into a purely religious thing. You almost like you read the account of Indian independence in here, and you almost think that it had nothing to do with regional differences, nothing to do with cultural differences, that it was just religion. That's all it was. Martin Luther King Jr. is summoned on these pages as a great and heroic figure someone who did more for to put the genuine ideals of Christianity into practice than any self-proclaimed Christian. But can Hitchens resist character assassination? No. So Dr. King plagiarized his doctoral thesis and loved to dissipate himself with loose women and tons of alcohol, including the night before he was murdered. Some of which may be partially true, but it's exaggerated here because Hitchens doesn't want anybody to get away with anything. So he brings up a murderous thug, dictator, or criminal of some kind, and then cherry picks the people who were religious who supported that person and makes almost no mention of the people who were religious and didn't, equally motivated by religion. And so it goes. Right through this chapter, everyone who comes up is character assassinated in one way or another. He has a long digression on novelist Evelyn Waugh, no idea why, and it talks about how Waugh's novels are some of his favorite in the English language, but Waugh doesn't escape a character assassination that is crude and one-sided. Probably the strongest example of that for me is also a toss-off line, where Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are referred to as slaveholders. John Adams did not hold slaves. He was not a slave owner. So that's either ignorance on Hitchens' part. You would think he wouldn't be able to be if he made a study of Thomas Paine. You'd think he'd know something about colonial era America. But either he's thinking, all the founding fathers were. Easy to see that in the lineup of, the first baker's dozen American presidents. It's easy to think that they were all slave owners, but they weren't. And so on and so forth. There was one part here that shows the kind of bouncing around that goes on here. Let's see here. At a minimum, this makes it impossible to argue that religion causes people to behave in a more kindly or civilized manner. The worse the offender, the more devout he turns out to be. Proof? No. It can be added that some of the most dedicated relief workers are also believers, though as it happens, the best ones I have met are secularists who were not trying to proselytize any faith. But the chance that a person committing a crime was faith-based was almost 100%, while the chances that a person of faith was on the side of humanity and decency were about as good as the odds of a coin flip. As you know from hearing me talk on this channel, I have lots and lots of grievances against organized religions of all kinds. I have lots and lots of grievances against them for some of the things that they twist their believers into being or doing or saying, and also just on the flat fact of their existence. The flat fact of their existence before you even argue the right or wrong of any kind of philosophical or theological doctrine is already an exponent of human chauvinism. It's already a way to separate one species of animal on Earth from all the other species of animal on Earth and all the evil that entails. So I have my beefs with organized religion, definitely, but I read a passage like that and I just wince. Hitchens picks out in this chapter, he cherry picks standout people, slaps a religious motivation onto them, and then invests them with all the evils that he can think of, or in the case of Martin Luther King, or later on, absurdly, Pope John Paul II, he will, grudgingly mention the good that they did, but make sure to shoo in the contextualizing of all the bad that they did. And I can say all the negative things that I've said about Christianity, and I can still immediately say that's not fair. It's not fair to do that. It's also ignorant. It's obvious from this chapter that Hitchens either paid no attention to or made no effort to see the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are moved from their core by their religious tenets and to do good. He mentions at one point in this chapter the story of a Muslim cab driver who returned a sum of money that Hitchens' wife had left in the cab by accident, and said that his faith in Islam prevented him from taking any kind of reward for that act. And not in this book, but in later speeches, Hitchens actually contrived to be offended by that. when in the account that's given in this book, I don't think there's any way that you can doubt that cab driver's sincerity. And I don't think there's any way that you can doubt the obverse. The implication of what the cab driver is saying is that if he himself, he's not talking about other people, he's saying if he himself had not internalized those moral beliefs from the Quran, he might not have returned the money. I don't see why that should be written off as servility. I don't see why that should be written off or ignored as just false, as nonsense. You're a human. You're a mammal. You would, of course, have done the right thing. I think that's insane. I have met so many religious people who have told me it's not that I would go out raping and murdering, but it's that I would be a worse person. I feel like my faith has turned on a light inside me. I've heard so many people refer to it that way, that I felt like my heart, my mind, my reasoning from day to day was dark. I felt I was groping in what an old friend of mine used to tweak me by calling moral relativism, and that their faith allows them to free themselves from that. To the good. To the good. To the good. People charge into fires to save people. Not firemen, but ordinary citizens run into fires to save people because their morality has been refined by their version of religion. Hitchens even mentions it at one point. He talks to when he's talking about Kony in Uganda, he talks about well, I'll never find it, but he talks about, it's a long chapter, unlike the last one. The last one was easy to find things for. But he talks to religious people who say that, well, that's one face of Christianity and I'm another. I'm here risking life and limb far away from my family and loved ones because I am called to serve by my religion. And he just writes it off. He just writes it off. People run into burning buildings to save people out of a morality that was refined by their religion. It was the religious who tended to the sick, to plague victims, to lepers, to all sorts of outcasts, social outcasts of all kinds, were given mercy, money, clothing, a roof over their head by religious people for religious reasons. That has happened behind the scenes, without headlines, without being Kony or Gandhi or a king. That has happened behind the scenes in the last 2,000 years in innumerable instances. Innumerable. Where people, ordinary people who never made the headlines and never came to Christopher Hitchens' attention, internalized and actually acted on. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Do this, give. There's no way to quantify the effect, the positive effect that such teaching has had in 2,000 years of human history, but that's not a reason to dismiss it. It obviously has had an enormous effect, and a lot of that effect, I would argue most of it, has been good. So the question, does religion make people behave better in this chapter? Hitchens is clearly saying no, it doesn't. It makes them behave worse. He says that a priest, when he turns bad, is worse than anybody. Where is that quote? Yeah, I'll never find it. Okay, well, that's the problem here. I turned down pages, I made mental notes, but I didn't underline anything. I've been so accustomed to thin chapters. But he makes a point in here that when priests go bad, they go really bad. They commit crimes that would make even a hardened criminal blanch. That is not true. That is not true. They commit a kind of crime. They commit the kind of crime. When priests go bad, they commit the kinds of crimes that they have access to. Usually, peculation or molestation, but not genocide. And when they have access to genocide, priests or anybody else in religious orders commits it just the same as anybody who isn't. Again, this chapter is blurring the idea of religious identity and human nature in a way that isn't helpful. And the answer to the question, does religion make people behave better in this chapter, is clearly no. When there isn't a clear answer. There isn't a clear answer at all. I keep going back to one of David's points in one of his first videos, where he mentions that he sees religion as pushing the edges of everything. That's actually not bad. So you get someone who is already internally moral, already a caring, empathetic person. Religion will tend to push that even more, so that their empathy becomes self-denying, even self-hurting. And the same thing is true if you have a power-mad megalomaniac. Religion will push them to the edge. It will push them a little further because it gives them a vocabulary. It gives them a license. An extra relevant subject today in America, since the President of the United States has just recently declared himself to be the second coming of God and the King of Israel. And not a peep out of the vast hordes of Republican voters all across America, and especially the elected members of the Republican Congress, who for 8 years accused Barack Obama of having a Messiah complex. Because he spoke in complete sentences, because he didn't fly off the handle, because he was a measured, calm adult in the room. Because of that, and for very little other reason, they referred to him as having a Messiah complex, a dangerous, megalomaniacal Messiah complex. Here, they have the President of the United States actually retweeting a claim that he is the Messiah, and not a peep out of any of them. So we have religious trappings. We have the whole question of, does organized religion make you behave better, is brought to the headlines in odd and fractured ways. Donald Trump is, of course, one of a handful of U.S. presidents who is an atheist. Most U.S. presidents have not been, if only because you cannot believe you are anointed by heaven if you don't believe in heaven. So most U.S. presidents who've been overweening egotists for their whole lives have also married that with a kind of religious faith. There's only been a handful who no one's ever said, I'm an atheist, of course. You can't do that and be in public life in America. But there are a handful of people, there have been a handful of presidents who obviously had no personal religious faith of any kind. Hitchens actually brings up Abraham Lincoln in this chapter as a potential candidate for one of those. Mentions one of Lincoln's closest friends and confidants, who had endless piles of letters from him that were destroyed, so we don't have them, who said late in life that Lincoln was an unbeliever, that he didn't believe in any kind of God or religion. And Hitchens actually discounts that. No one can be safe. No one can be immune. No one can be Hitchens before Hitchens. So he discounts that and says, well, that's almost certainly not true. He was probably just a deist of some kind, believed vaguely in some kind of God. Lincoln's closest confidant said that he was an atheist, but never mind. but Lincoln would be a good example. There are a handful of others. Trump is an obvious example. He is an obvious atheist. He doesn't believe in a God. He never has. It never even crosses his mind, except when he has to mention it. And that makes it all the more, I think, illustrative of David's point. This is a person who doesn't even believe in what he's saying. He's still using religion to push the edges, about as far as they will go. If you have a president who is taking a 38% popularity rating and calling himself God, then who knows what he'd do with an 80% popularity rating. But of course, it's in the front news. So so the question, does religion make people behave better? I think the answer is it depends on the person. But I think there's no denying that it can. So anyway, that is this chapter. That was chapter 13. And tomorrow we're going to go on to chapter 14, which is there is no Eastern solution. So this book only has about 20 chapters, right? The book has 19 chapters, so we are getting there. We are slowly but surely reading our way through God is Not Great. And I'd be curious to see what David makes of this chapter. Another odd feature of this read-along is that we're not consulting with each other on the Voxer that the kids like so much. We're not bothering, so I don't know what he's going to say about any chapter until he gets to it. There's a lot of meat on the bones in this chapter, so he might find a lot to talk about. I'll watch with eagerness, and I hope you do too. So I will wrap this up for now. We have lots of other bookish stuff to talk about, though, so I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.